Records disappeared. Testimonies were buried. The truth remained. John J. Geoghan was not a man who looked dangerous. He was soft-spoken, approachable, and almost invisible in the way clergy often are meant to be. For decades, he moved quietly through parishes in Massachusetts, assigned and reassigned by the Archdiocese of Boston. To parents, he was a trusted priest. To children, he was authority wrapped in kindness. To the institution above him, he was a problem that could be managed so long as it was never spoken about aloud. Geoghan's story did not begin with a crime scene or a police report. It began with silence. In the 1960s and 1970s, complaints began to surface. Parents noticed changes in their children's withdrawal, fear, sudden behavioral shifts. Some spoke up. Letters were written. Meetings were held behind closed doors. What followed was not accountability, but relocation. Geoghan was quietly transferred from one parish to another, sometimes across county lines, sometimes across communities that would never know his past. Each move came with sealed records. Internal church documents were marked confidential. Psychological evaluations were commissioned, reviewed, and buried. In some cases, Geoghan was sent to church-run treatment facilities, not to remove him permanently from ministry, but to rehabilitate him just enough to be placed somewhere new. The crimes continued. Over the years, Geoghan would be accused of sexually abusing more than 130 boys, one of the most prolific abusers in the history of the American Catholic Church. The abuse followed a pattern. He targeted vulnerable children, often those from broken homes or families deeply tied to the church. He used confession, spiritual guidance, and trust as tools. The acts occurred in rectories, parish buildings, and church-sponsored activity spaces considered safe by design. Parents who confronted church officials were often met with deflection. Some were told they misunderstood. Others were encouraged to forgive, to pray, to avoid scandal. In certain cases, settlements were quietly paid with strict non-disclosure agreements. Families accepted money not because it had raised the damage, but because it was the only acknowledgement they were ever offered. The sealed files grew thicker. By the 1980s, law enforcement had limited visibility. The church operated as its own closed system, invoking religious autonomy and confidentiality. Abuse allegations were treated as internal matters. When reports did reach civil authorities, they were often incomplete, delayed, or unsupported by documentation that the church had already locked away. It wasn't until the late 1990s that cracks began to form. In 2002, investigative journalists at the Boston Globe Spotlight team uncovered internal church records that revealed the scope of the cover-up. Documents showed that Cardinal Bernard Law and other senior officials were aware of Geoghan's behavior for years, decades, even and repeatedly chose institutional protection over public safety. The files detailed complaints, evaluations, warnings, and decisions that knowingly placed children in harm's way. What had been sealed was not ignorance, it was evidence. Public outrage followed swiftly. Victims came forward in waves, many for the first time. Men in their 30s, 40s, and 50s spoke about abuse they had carried silently since childhood. The emotional weight was staggering. Careers derailed, relationships fractured, faith destroyed. The damage, unlike the files, had never been contained. Geoghan was finally arrested in 2002. In 2003, he was convicted of indecent assault and battery and sentenced to prison. For many survivors, the conviction felt hollow too late, too small, too narrow compared to the scale of what had been done. Justice came slowly and incompletely. In 2003, Geoghan was murdered in prison by another inmate. With his death, many questions died too. There would be no further testimony, no full accounting from the man himself, no confrontation between abuser and the countless lives he altered. But the story did not end with him. The exposure of Geoghan's case triggered a global reckoning. Thousands of sealed church files across the world were scrutinized. Similar patterns emerged in Ireland, Australia, Germany, and beyond. Abuse had not been isolated. It had been systemic, enabled by secrecy, hierarchy, and the prioritization of reputation over responsibility. Cardinal Bernard Law resigned and was reassigned to Rome, never criminally charged. The institution survived. Many victims did not. For those abused by Geoghan, the sealed files represented more than paperwork. They symbolized years stolen, voices ignored, and suffering postponed for the sake of order and image. Some survivors never received therapy. Others never received apologies. Many never received peace. The church issued public statements, policies were revised, safeguards were promised, but none of it could return childhoods that had been fractured in silence. This case revealed a devastating truth. When records are sealed, harm does not disappear. It multiplies, it travels, it waits. John Geoghan did not operate in darkness by accident. He was shielded by an institution that chose concealment over confrontation. And in that choice, generations paid the price. The files were sealed. The damage was not. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped? Or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Larry Nassar was not a priest, but his case followed the same pattern of institutional protection, sealed records, and prolonged silence that defines crimes behind trusted authority. His position was different, his uniform was different, but the system that protected him functioned in the same way churches have shielded abusive leaders for decades. For years, Larry Nassar was celebrated as a miracle worker. He was the longtime team doctor for USA Gymnastics, a physician at Michigan State University, and a trusted medical professional for hundreds of young girls chasing Olympic dreams. Parents handed their daughters over to him, believing they were doing the safest thing possible. Coaches praised him, institutions elevated him, and behind closed doors, the abuse continued. Nassar's crimes were hidden not by a lack of complaints, but by how those complaints were handled. As early as the late 1990s, concerns were raised about his medical treatments. Girls described procedures that made them uncomfortable, confused, and ashamed. Some spoke up immediately, others took years. But when reports reached university officials, athletic administrators, and governing bodies, they were quietly routed through internal channels. Files were created, notes were taken, and then, those files were sealed. Michigan State University conducted internal reviews. USA Gymnastics logged complaints. Doctors discussed concerns privately. No one went to the police. No warnings were issued to parents. No meaningful restrictions were placed on Nassar's access to children. Instead, he was allowed to continue. Nassar exploited the authority of medicine the same way abusive clergy exploit faith. He framed his actions as necessary, specialized, and misunderstood. He used medical jargon to confuse patients. He insisted on privacy. He told victims that pain was normal, that discomfort meant the treatment was working. When girls hesitated, he reassured them. When they questioned him, he reminded them of his credentials, and the institutions believed him. Between sealed investigations and quiet reassurances, Nassar remained untouchable. His reputation insulated him. His success protected him. Every medal won by gymnasts he treated became another reason not to look too closely. The damage grew. By the time law enforcement became involved in 2016, more than 500 women and girls would ultimately report abuse. Some were as young as 6 years old. Many had competed internationally. Others were local athletes whose names would never appear on television. The scale was staggering, and the timeline devastating. Abuse that could have been stopped early was allowed to span decades. When the case finally exploded into public view, the sealed files came back into focus. Documents revealed that multiple institutions had known. Complaints had been minimized. Language had been softened. Reports had been reframed as misunderstandings. Internal reviews replaced external accountability. The system worked exactly as designed. In court, survivor after survivor stood to testify. Their statements were not just about Nassar. They were indictments of the institutions that failed them. Women spoke about the shame they carried, the trust that was destroyed, and the years lost to trauma that could have been prevented. Nassar was sentenced to up to 175 years in prison. The punishment was severe, but for many survivors, it felt incomplete. No sentence could restore what had been taken. No conviction could erase the knowledge that adults had known and chosen silence. Michigan State University paid massive settlements. USA Gymnastics filed for bankruptcy. Officials resigned. Apologies were issued. Policies were rewritten. But the damage had already been done. Some survivors struggled with addiction. Others battled depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress. Careers ended. Bodies broke down. Dreams collapsed under the weight of betrayal. The sealed files told a story not of ignorance, but of risk management. Institutions weighed reputation against harm and chose to delay action. Each delay created new victims. Each sealed report became another chapter in a crime that didn't need to continue. Larry Nassar did not act alone. He was enabled by a system that trusted authority more than children, credentials more than testimony, and silence more than truth. This case proves something chilling. Sealing records does not protect the innocent, it protects the abuser. And while institutions move on, the damage follows survivors for life. The files were sealed. The damage wasn't. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Jerry Sandusky was known as a builder of young men. For decades, he stood on the sidelines of Penn State University football games as a trusted defensive coordinator, celebrated for discipline, loyalty, and mentorship. He founded a charity for vulnerable children. He was praised as a role model. Parents believed their sons were safe around him. Administrators believed he was indispensable. The truth existed quietly, in fragments, long before the world knew his name. As early as the late 1990s, allegations surfaced that Sandusky was sexually abusing boys he met through his charity and his access to athletic facilities. These were not rumors whispered in isolation. They were concerns raised to supervisors, administrators, and campus authorities. Meetings were held, notes were taken, decisions were made behind closed doors. What followed was not decisive action, but containment. Sandusky was encouraged to retire. His access was supposedly limited. His charity continued to operate. He retained keys. He remained welcome in locker rooms and showers. No police report was filed. No public warning was issued. The institution chose to manage risk rather than confront reality. The abuse continued. Sandusky exploited trust with chilling precision. He targeted boys from unstable backgrounds, offering mentorship, gifts, and a sense of belonging. He framed his abuse as affection, discipline, or care. Children who resisted were confused. Those who spoke were uncertain anyone would believe them. Inside the institution, knowledge was compartmentalized. Emails circulated. Conversations happened in hallways. Senior leaders discussed handling the situation. What was created was not accountability, but plausible deniability. Files existed, reports existed, but they remained sealed within the university's administrative structure. Years passed. In 2011, the case finally exploded into public view after a grand jury. Investigation revealed the scale of abuse and the depth of institutional failure. Sandusky was charged with dozens of counts related to sexual assault of minors. Testimony revealed not just his crimes, but how often warning signs had been ignored. The trial was devastating. Victims described years of abuse and years of silence. Some had tried to tell adults and were brushed aside. Others had believed what Sandusky told them, that no one would help, that this was normal, that speaking up would only make things worse. Sandusky was convicted and sentenced to decades in prison. The punishment was severe, but the focus quickly shifted to the institution that allowed him to operate unchecked. University leaders resigned. Investigations confirmed that senior administrators had failed to report known concerns. Internal documents revealed a culture more concerned with reputation than protection. The university paid massive settlements. Reforms were announced. Apologies were issued. For survivors, none of it erased the damage. Many struggled with addiction, depression, and broken relationships. Some never trusted authority again. Others carried guilt for not speaking sooner, despite being children at the time. The sealed files had not just hidden abuse, they had prolonged it. The Sandusky case became a defining example of institutional silence. It showed how power, prestige, and fear of scandal can override moral obligation. How sealed records can become shields. How delay can become destruction. Jerry Sandusky did not operate alone. He was enabled by inaction, protected by process, insulated by reputation. The files were sealed. The damage wasn't. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Marcial Maciel was revered as a living saint long before his crimes were acknowledged. To the Vatican, he was a model priest. To wealthy donors, he was a spiritual visionary. To thousands of young men, he was a founder, mentor, and unquestionable authority. And to the institution that elevated him, he was too valuable to fall. For more than half a century, Marcial Maciel led the Legionaries of Christ, a powerful Catholic religious order known for discipline, loyalty, and absolute obedience. He built schools, seminaries, and universities across multiple continents. He cultivated relationships with cardinals, bishops, and popes. His order produced money, influence, and unwavering allegiance to Rome. What it also produced was silence. From the 1950s onward, allegations followed Maciel like a shadow. Seminarians accused him of sexual abuse. Young boys described assaults disguised as spiritual acts. Some said he framed abuse as a holy obligation, telling victims that what he was doing relieved his suffering and pleased God. He invoked divine authority to ensure compliance. Shame, fear, and reverence sealed their mouths. When complaints reached the Vatican, they did not disappear. They were documented. Files were opened. Testimonies were recorded. And then, those files were sealed. Maciel's influence made him untouchable. He presented himself as a defender of orthodoxy, at a time when the Church feared modernity and dissent. He positioned his order as loyal soldiers of faith. Donations flowed. Political protection followed. Every allegation was reframed as an attack on the Church itself. Victims were dismissed as liars or enemies. Some were threatened with expulsion. Others were isolated and spiritually condemned. A few were pressured into silence by senior clergy. Internal investigations stalled. Canonical proceedings were delayed indefinitely. The Church chose containment over confrontation. Maciel continued. Behind the public image of purity, he lived a double life. He fathered multiple children with different women, some of whom he also abused. He used church funds to support secret families. He manipulated followers into covering his absences, forging documents, and defending him publicly. The structure he built was designed to protect him completely. In the 1990s, a group of victims finally went public, accusing Maciel of repeated sexual abuse during their time as seminarians. Their testimonies were detailed, consistent, and devastating. Media outlets reported the allegations. Pressure mounted. Still, the Vatican hesitated. Investigations were opened, then quietly closed. Officials cited insufficient evidence. Maciel remained in good standing. He appeared at public events. He was praised by Pope John Paul II, who referred to him as an efficacious guide of youth. For victims, the message was unmistakable. The institution had chosen its champion. Only after Pope John Paul II's death did the situation shift. In 2006, the Vatican announced that Maciel had been ordered to withdraw from public ministry and live a life of prayer and penance. No trial, no conviction, no acknowledgement of guilt. The language was deliberately vague. The files remained sealed. Maciel died in 2008. It was only after his death that the full truth was officially recognized. The Vatican admitted that the accusations were credible. Investigations revealed decades of abuse, deception, and institutional failure. The Legionaries of Christ issued public apologies. Leadership was restructured. Reforms were promised. For victims, it was devastatingly late. Many had spent their lives battling trauma, addiction, broken faith, and silence. Some had died without hearing the truth acknowledged. Others struggled to reconcile the abuse they endured with the faith they were taught to obey without question. The sealed files told a story of protection, not ignorance. Church officials had known, they had documented, they had delayed, they had calculated the cost of exposure and decided it was too high. Maciel ruled not through fear alone, but through devotion engineered into obedience. He weaponized faith, authority, and secrecy, and the institution that could have stopped him chose to shield him instead. The files were sealed to protect the Church. The damage was carried by the victims for a lifetime. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Theodore Edgar McCarrick spent most of his life wrapped in the language of moral authority. He was a priest, then a bishop, then an archbishop, and finally a cardinal of the Roman Catholic Church, one of the most powerful religious institutions in the world. He traveled internationally, raised millions for charity, advised popes, and spoke publicly about human rights and ethical leadership. To the faithful, he was a shepherd. To the Vatican, he was a diplomat. Two young men seeking a religious vocation, he was a gatekeeper to God. Behind that image, the abuse stretched back decades. McCarrick's pattern was quiet, calculated, and persistent. As early as the 1970s, rumors circulated among seminarians and clergy about his behavior. Young men spoke privately about being invited to beach houses, rectories, and overnight trips where boundaries dissolved. They described pressure, manipulation, and sexual abuse that was framed as mentorship or spiritual intimacy. Some were told this was how advancement worked. Others were warned that speaking up would end their calling. Many stayed silent. Those who did speak were rarely heard beyond closed doors. Complaints were passed upward within church hierarchy, logged as concerns, and quietly set aside. Letters reached bishops, reports reached Rome, files were opened and sealed. McCarrick was moved, promoted, and praised. Each step upward insulated him further. By the 1990s, allegations had multiplied. Multiple dioceses had knowledge of settlements paid to adult victims, accompanied by strict non-disclosure agreements. Money changed hands quietly. No admissions of guilt were made. The Church framed the accusations as moral lapses, not crimes. Law enforcement was not notified. Parishioners were not warned. The system worked exactly as it was designed to. McCarrick's rise continued. In 2001, he was appointed Archbishop of Washington, D.C., one of the most influential positions in American Catholicism. Soon after, he was elevated to cardinal. The promotion came despite internal knowledge that allegations existed. Vatican officials later acknowledged that concerns had reached Rome years earlier, but the files remained closed. Young seminarians continued to encounter him. Some described a culture where refusal felt impossible. Their futures depended on recommendations, assignments, and favor. McCarrick understood this leverage. He used it. Authority became coercion. Faith became a weapon. The damage compounded over time. Victims carried the weight, silently confusion, shame, guilt, and a fractured sense of belief. Some left the church entirely. Others stayed, believing the abuse was their own failing. Many waited decades before telling anyone, and when they did, they encountered an institution trained to deflect, delay, and protect itself. Everything changed in 2018. A credible allegation emerged that McCarrick had sexually abused a minor decades earlier. Unlike previous complaints involving adults, this accusation triggered mandatory reporting obligations. An internal Vatican investigation concluded the claim was credible. Public pressure exploded. Media scrutiny intensified. The sealed files began to crack open. What emerged was devastating. Church officials admitted that McCarrick's behavior had been an open secret in some circles. Restrictions had been imposed quietly at various times. Requests that he limit travel, avoid seminaries, or live discreetly. None were enforced consistently. None were disclosed publicly. He continued to move freely, celebrate Mass, and represent the Church on the world stage. The Vatican released a report acknowledging that warnings had been received, but minimized. Leaders cited incomplete information, cultural failures, and misplaced trust. The reality was simpler. Confronting McCarrick earlier would have meant acknowledging systemic failure at the highest levels. In 2019, Theodore McCarrick was lazy, stripped of his priesthood. It was an extraordinary act, rare in church history, but it came after decades of abuse, after countless victims, after lives permanently altered. Criminal prosecution followed. In 2021, McCarrick was charged in Massachusetts with sexually assaulting a teenage boy in the 1970s for the first time. The legal system confronted what the church had buried. The trial was halted in 2023 after McCarrick was deemed medically unfit to stand trial due to dementia. The case ended without a verdict. For survivors, it was another silence. No courtroom reckoning, no testimony heard, no verdict spoken. Once again, the process closed before truth could fully surface. The files had been unsealed just enough to expose the damage, but not enough to deliver justice. The broader consequences rippled outward. Faith in leadership collapsed. Catholics questioned how such a man could rise so high for so long. Investigations revealed patterns that mirrored other scandals. Complaints redirected inward. Settlements sealed. Promotions granted in spite of risk. The church issued apologies. Reforms were promised. Reporting mechanisms were revised. But survivors remained skeptical. They had seen how easily procedures could be ignored when power demanded protection. Theodore McCarrick did not abuse because the church did not know. He abused because the church knew and chose containment over confrontation. His story is not only about one man, but about an institution that sealed truth to preserve authority. The files documented warning after warning. They were closed to avoid scandal. And while they sat untouched, the damage spread across generations of faith, trust, and human lives. The files were sealed. The damage wasn't. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Philip B. Danielson, better known to his followers as Pastor Phil, was the founder of a sprawling evangelical network in the Midwest, a man whose charisma drew thousands of worshippers to his Sunday services and nightly broadcasts. On the surface, he was a devoted husband, an inspirational speaker, and a pillar of his community. He He preached family values, prosperity, and obedience to God, and the congregation adored him. Donations poured in. Media outlets celebrated his programs. To the world, he was untouchable. Inside the church, the story was darker. Over the years, multiple staff members reported unsettling behavior. Danielson isolated young women, placing them in mentorship roles that blurred personal and spiritual boundaries. He monitored personal relationships, dictating who could interact with whom, and demanded strict loyalty. Those who resisted or questioned him faced demotion, removal, or social ostracism. Allegations surfaced that he coerced sexual favors from staff under the guise of spiritual discipline, claims that were carefully managed internally to avoid public exposure. Families who tried to speak out were discouraged. Danielson wielded his public image as a shield, asserting that anyone questioning him was challenging God's work. Complaints were funneled through church boards and internal committees. Records were kept, but access was limited, and files were often marked confidential, never reaching law enforcement or public scrutiny. The church's lawyers ensured that statements were vague, non-committal, and designed to protect the institution. If outside investigators ever asked, they were met with polite denials and Danielson's behavior escalated over decades. Young women were moved into positions of close contact with him. He leveraged his authority to pressure them into compliance, framing requests as divine guidance or necessary sacrifices for spiritual growth. The emotional and spiritual coercion was subtle but relentless. Victims described feeling trapped, confused, and ashamed, afraid that resistance would bring spiritual condemnation, professional ruin, or social isolation. Meanwhile, the church expanded. Satellite campuses opened. Television and radio programs multiplied. Danielson's influence was magnified. The higher his profile rose, the less likely anyone inside or outside the organization was willing or able to challenge him. Internal documents noted the complaints, but these were buried in sealed files that remained inaccessible to anyone outside the church's legal and executive structure. The longer they remained hidden, the more victims were placed at risk. It was not until investigative journalists and former staffers came forward in the 2010s that the scale of Danielson's abuses became widely known. They revealed decades of misconduct, including manipulation, sexual coercion, and the systemic silencing of victims. Survivors spoke publicly about trauma endured in silence, the fear of questioning authority, and the pervasive culture of control that allowed one man to dominate lives for decades. Legal action finally followed. Danielson faced charges for sexual misconduct and coercion against multiple women. The proceedings were complicated by the church's internal records, non-disclosure agreements, and careful management of evidence. Some victims were hesitant to testify, fearing retaliation or damage to their faith community. Nevertheless, prosecutors amassed enough testimony to secure convictions, and Danielson was sentenced to prison for his crimes. The legal process confirmed what the sealed files had long indicated, that abuse had been ongoing, methodically hidden, and enabled by institutional protection. The aftermath rippled across the congregation and community. Some members left entirely, disillusioned by the betrayal of trust. Others struggled to reconcile their faith with the actions of their leader. Survivors sought therapy, support, and acknowledgement, but many reported long-term psychological, emotional, and spiritual effects. Trust, once broken, proved difficult to rebuild. The church issued statements of apology, implemented new safeguarding measures, and promised transparency. Yet the shadow of decades of secrecy remained. The story of Philip B. Danielson is a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked authority. When institutions prioritize reputation over responsibility, when files are sealed and complaints are buried, abuse flourishes in plain sight. Authority, when left unchallenged, can manipulate devotion into complicity. Faith, when weaponized, can become a trap, and victims, left unheard, carry the damage long after the perpetrator's public persona has been restored or the institution has moved on. The files were sealed. The damage wasn't. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. Jim Jones was not a man who walked unnoticed. He commanded attention. Born in 1931 in Indiana, he grew up blending charm with menace, intellect with obsession. His early life was marked by religious fervor and political radicalism, and these twin forces would come to define the dangerous power he wielded later in life. Jones was not just a preacher, he was a manipulator, a planner, and a visionary whose vision would spiral into tragedy for hundreds, if not thousands. In the 1950s, Jones founded the People's Temple, a congregation initially dedicated to progressive social change and racial integration. At a time when segregation scarred communities across the United States, he positioned the temple as a beacon of equality, offering shelter, employment, and hope to those rejected by society. People gravitated toward him. They saw a man who preached love, community, and salvation. They did not see the darkness he carried. The first signs of abuse were subtle. Followers who questioned Jones were shamed publicly, labeled as traitors to God, or subjected to psychological manipulation. Children were particularly vulnerable. Jones preached that obedience to him was obedience to God. His charisma, combined with spiritual authority, ensured compliance. Doubt was treated as sin, and confession became a tool for monitoring the thoughts and fears of his followers. Internal complaints began to emerge in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Allegations of sexual misconduct with minors surfaced, as well as claims of emotional and physical abuse within the temple community. Parents voiced concerns, often privately, to avoid public scandal. Local authorities and social service agencies were informed, but the complaints rarely progressed. The People's Temple cultivated a reputation for charity and civic engagement, presenting a facade that masked the reality of abuse within. When confronted with allegations, Jones was strategic. He relocated his congregation several times, eventually establishing Jonestown, a remote settlement in Guyana. Jonestown was designed to isolate his followers, cut them off from outside influence, and create a self-contained world under his absolute control. Families uprooted their lives to follow him, trusting in his vision. Children were educated under his strict doctrine. Adults were subjected to loyalty tests and indoctrination exercises that blurred reality, fear, and devotion. The abuses continued and intensified. Jones exercised control over sexual behavior, marriages, and personal relationships. Reports suggest that he coerced sexual acts from both adults and minors, under the guise of communal expectation and spiritual obligation. Threats, manipulation, and fear reinforced his authority. Any attempt to resist was met with public humiliation, ostracism, or promises of divine punishment. The psychological environment he created made reporting abuse nearly impossible. Complaints occasionally reached journalists and government officials in the United States, but intervention was limited. The isolation of Jonestown, combined with Jones's carefully cultivated image as a humanitarian and spiritual leader, delayed meaningful investigation. Church, media, and government officials were faced with a man whose public persona contrasted sharply with the secret suffering of his congregation. By the late 1970s, the situation reached a tipping point. Congressman Leo Ryan visited Jonestown to investigate allegations of abuse and forced confinement. Some temple members sought to leave with him, fearing retribution. What followed was catastrophic. At an airstrip in Guyana, Jones's followers ambushed Ryan and his party, killing him along with journalists and defectors. This act of violence was the prelude to an even greater tragedy. Jones orchestrated the mass murder-suicide of over 900 people in Jonestown. Adults, children, and infants were forced to ingest cyanide-laced punch. Those who resisted were coerced at gunpoint. Mothers were compelled to watch their children die first. The scale of the tragedy was unprecedented in American civilian life outside of natural disasters. The deaths exposed not only Jones's capacity for manipulation and cruelty, but also the systemic failures that allowed his power to grow unchecked. Survivors were left to grapple with unimaginable trauma. They recounted years of fear, coercion, and loss. Families were shattered. Communities were devastated. The psychological scars of Jonestown extended far beyond those who were physically present. Witnesses, journalists, and relatives of victims experienced a ripple effect of grief, anger, and disbelief that lasted decades. Investigations into Jonestown revealed how carefully Jones had concealed his abuses. Records of complaints, internal communications, and survivor testimonies showed that authorities had information but often lacked the leverage, jurisdiction, or understanding to act decisively. Files existed that documented early abuse, but they were scattered, uncoordinated, or the bureaucratic and institutional failures contributed to a sense that Jones could act with impunity. Jones's death did not end the reckoning. Survivors began to speak out publicly, recounting the abuses they had endured and the manipulation they had witnessed. Researchers and journalists documented the events to ensure that history would remember the warning signs. The tragedy of Jonestown became a reference point for studies of cult dynamics, coercive control, and institutional negligence. It demonstrated how charismatic authority, isolation, and the concealment of complaints can combine to catastrophic effect. Families and communities struggled with anger, guilt, and grief. Some survivors sought justice through lawsuits and advocacy, aiming to expose the complicity of those who had shielded Jones or ignored early warnings. Others devoted their lives to education, warning about the dangers of unchecked authority and psychological manipulation. Organizations were founded to provide support for those recovering from coercive and cult-related trauma. The legacy of Jim Jones in Jonestown continues to serve as a chilling reminder of the cost of secrecy and institutional failure. It highlights the danger posed when individuals in positions of trust are protected, whether by bureaucracy, reputation, or fear of scandal. It underscores the importance of vigilance, transparency, and accountability in institutions that hold power over vulnerable populations. The sealed files of complaints and reports from the early years of the People's Temple were silent witnesses to a catastrophe that could have been mitigated. Each document, each ignored warning, each delayed investigation contributed to the eventual scale of suffering. Yet for those inside Jonestown, the files were irrelevant. The damage was already done. Jim Jones's story is one of manipulation, authority, and devastation. It is a story not only of a man who wielded power destructively, but also of a system that enabled him through inaction, obfuscation, and secrecy. It serves as a warning to every institution entrusted with the care of others. When complaints are sealed and problems hidden, harm does not disappear. It accumulates, multiplies, and eventually consumes. The files were sealed. The damage wasn't. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments. John Smythe was a pastor in a tight-knit community in the Pacific Northwest. Known for his eloquent sermons and tireless work with youth programs, he founded the Lighthouse Fellowship in the early 1990s, a church that attracted hundreds of families with promises of faith, guidance, and community. To outsiders, he was a devoted leader and philanthropist, a man who organized charity events, youth camps, and mentorship programs. To parents, he was trustworthy. To children, he was a mentor, a guide, and someone whose approval mattered deeply. But behind closed doors, Smythe's behavior was predatory. Reports first emerged in the early 2000s. Staff members noticed irregular interactions between Smythe and teenage boys. Complaints were raised discreetly, whispered concerns in staff meetings. Notes passed to church elders, even informal reports to the Regional Council of Pastors. Parents of some children suspected something but were reassured repeatedly that Smythe was a man of integrity, that the church protected children, and that no accusations had been substantiated. The church's internal handling of complaints was deliberate and calculated. Smythe's files were kept private, marked confidential and internal use only. Allegations were investigated minimally, often dismissed with vague language, noting a lack of evidence or framing concerns as misunderstandings. Smythe was counseled privately, allowed to continue ministry, and in some cases transferred to another program within the church where fewer people might notice. The files existed, but they were sealed from public scrutiny and law enforcement. Smythe's predatory behavior escalated over time. He leveraged his authority and charisma to isolate young boys, inviting them to one-on-one Bible studies, overnight retreats, and volunteer trips. He used spiritual language to manipulate them, framing obedience and secrecy as tests of faith. Resistance was met with emotional coercion, shame, fear of God's judgment, or ostracism within the youth group. Some victims were told that confiding in anyone would be a betrayal of the Lord, that God would punish them for disobedience. The abuse extended beyond sexual misconduct. Smythe fostered psychological control. Boys were encouraged to report on each other, creating an environment of surveillance and mistrust. He discouraged outside relationships and subtly manipulated parents, cultivating loyalty while isolating victims. Every complaint that reached church authorities was handled internally, often in ways that ensured no formal investigation or criminal referral would occur. By 2010, former victims began to speak out. Some found the courage to confront Smythe and church leaders directly. They recounted abuse that had spanned nearly a decade, describing how their trust had been exploited and their faith weaponized. Legal action was pursued, and investigative journalists uncovered sealed church documents detailing prior complaints, counseling records, and internal warnings that had been ignored or suppressed. The resulting trial was a turning point. Court proceedings revealed not only Smythe's abuse but also the systemic failure of the church to protect children. Witnesses testified about sealed files, internal memos, and the deliberate efforts made to conceal allegations from authorities. Parents expressed horror at the realization that leaders they trusted had prioritized reputation over safety. The evidence presented a pattern of institutional neglect, cover-up, and complicity that allowed Smythe's crimes to continue unchecked. Smythe was convicted on multiple counts of sexual abuse and misconduct with minors. He was sentenced to decades in prison, a measure of justice for some, but insufficient for many victims whose lives had been irreparably altered. The church faced civil lawsuits and public scrutiny. Former congregants demanded accountability, resignations, and reforms. The community was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that someone they admired had abused their power for years and that those abuses could have been curtailed if early complaints had been taken seriously. Survivors faced the long-term consequences of Smythe's actions and the church's failures. Many struggled with PTSD, depression, and anxiety. Relationships with family, friends, and faith communities were strained or destroyed. Some had left organized religion entirely. Others carried the weight of secrecy and guilt for decades, believing they were complicit simply for surviving. Even with convictions and public acknowledgement, the damage remained persistent and profound. The case exposed a troubling pattern. When institutions seal files and internal complaints, abuse is not stopped, it is postponed. Perpetrators gain time, victims accumulate trauma, and trust within communities is eroded. The Lighthouse Fellowship's attempt to protect its image by concealing allegations resulted in years of additional harm and suffering. The John Smythe case serves as a stark reminder of the consequences of secrecy. Even in modern times, with legal frameworks and reporting mechanisms in place, institutions can fail to act, placing the vulnerable in prolonged danger. Transparency, accountability, and proactive intervention are not just procedural, they are life-saving. Smythe's actions, combined with the church's sealed files, left a legacy of trauma, mistrust, and heartbreak that continues to affect survivors to this day. The files were sealed, the damage wasn't. What part of this case shocked you the most? Would you have escaped, or fallen into the trap? Let me know in the comments.